There's growing evidence that boys and men are struggling in today's society across a wide array of areas like mental health, education, work, and family. So what's causing it, and how do we go about fixing it?
Both the political left and the political right have just, I think, really bungled this issue, leading us, I think, to the cultural situation that we're in.
On this episode, we sit down with national scholar Richard Reeves, the author of the book Of Boys and Men, and the president of the American Institute for Boys and Men. We discuss some of the political controversies that arise when addressing this issue, and give you a roadmap to understand these challenges and to be part of the solution. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn, and we're pleased to have back in the studio Beth Akers from AEI. Beth, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Nick. I'm so glad to be here again.
So am I. We've had a lot of great conversations in the past, and for this new kind of iteration of conversations, we're going to be talking about the well-being of men and boys. And we actually have a great interview today with Richard Reeves, who's one of the national thought leaders on this issue. Let's talk for a minute. How do we tee this up for our listeners? What do they need to be thinking about as we go into these kinds of conversations?
Well, this is an exciting topic for me. I'm an old friend of Richard's, and I got interested in this subject because he started writing about it, and also because I'm a boy mom. I've got two little boys at home, and so it was several years ago Richard started writing about the issues that were facing men and boys in a really honest and open way that I feel like the popular discourse has kind of neglected to do recently. I think there's a bit of fear of talking about what's going on with boys and men and any sort of sense that they need our help, because does that mean that we're going to neglect to help girls and women in the ways that they need our help? So Richard has really positioned himself as somebody who's breaking open this conversation that, he's going to give us permission to talk about what's going on with boys and men, not in a way that's going to, have us not talking any longer about what's going on with women and girls. But it's really exciting because there's a lot of really important issues happening, with young men in the labor market and education, with young boys. And, we're just opening up this conversation, and we're opening it up here in Utah. And I'm really excited to be a part of that.
I resonate with that, especially on the personal end. My wife and I, we have two little boys as well. And so there's this personal investment that, of course, we want our boys to grow up in a thriving, flourishing way. And what our folks will hear and see when we get to our interview in just a minute with Richard is that I think he does it in a good way, to your point, that the issue of kind of flourishing or thriving for women versus men has some sensitivity around it sometimes, some controversy.
Right.
It is often used as a tool to sort of pit political ideologies against one another.
Right.
Conservatives are sometimes reluctant at getting into those conversations. Folks on the left approach it in a different way. So what I like about Richard, his approach, is it doesn't shy away from those things. It recognizes that folks on different sides of the political aisle might sort of have a predisposition to approaching this issue in a different way. But his book that we'll talk about, his institution, it kind of creates a structure for us to have those discussions and at times debates, to your point, in kind of a thoughtful, evidence-based way that I don't think we've had before.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of what this discussion ends up being about is masculinity, what it means to be a man. Of course, a lot of people are going to disagree about those concepts, but something that struck me early in Richard's work in this area was that he pushed back on the idea that culturally we had really embraced these ideas of toxic masculinity. And he said, there's got to be another way of looking at that. And, as a young boy mom myself, I thought, yes, I don't want to characterize my boys in this way, but there is something different about boys and girls. And I think what Richard does is gives us an opportunity to frame a conversation in a more productive and positive way. So I'm really excited about the conversation with Richard today, but also the conversations we're going to be having going forward.
And I think that as we get into this conversation, maybe some signals, for lack of a better term, for our audience out there, think of how the data he brings to the table, the way he approaches the issue, just his natural affect that's so personable and warm and welcoming, but evidence-based, should, and I think does, create an environment that if you're a firm conservative, a firm progressive, somewhere in the middle, wherever you are as far as how you view these issues, there are entry points into this conversation for you and in a way that I think is productive, that doesn't kind of force you to abandon principles that you hold if they're solid principles.
Yeah.
And again, the hope with all this is, as you said, the recognition that boys and girls tend to be different, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
But how do we create a society where both boys and girls have the full opportunity to flourish? And maybe that has some differences at times.
Right.
But I love that. Just it's all about flourishing together.
Right. Absolutely. So I think Richard does a great job. He comes from the left. Richard and I actually work together at the Brookings Institution, which is a think tank that supports Democratic policymakers for the most part. And so Richard is sort of crossing the aisle here on this issue because it's one that the right has covered in the past, but it's kind of been neglected to be picked up in the, popular discourse, particularly in mainstream media. So Richard is really embracing, I think, a bipartisan conversation here and allowing an engagement across people of different beliefs that is really powerful.
Well, with that, let's go ahead and jump into our interview. Again, this is with Richard Reeves, who's the author of a new book called Of Boys and Men. We'll talk about at length, Beth and I, together with Richard, with our special feature today on the issue of men and boys. So let's go ahead and jump right into the interview. Joining us now in the virtual studio is Richard Reeves. He's the president of the American Institute for Boys and Men. He's been a Brookings scholar. He's also the author of the book Of Boys and Men that we're going to be talking about today. Why the modern male is struggling, why it matters, and what to do about it. Richard, welcome to Defending Ideas.
Hey, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
We're grateful for your time and your work on this issue. And Beth and I were speaking just a minute ago about how this feels like an important conversation to have across the country, but I think also here in Utah. It's really, really vital to be having these kinds of discussions on issues that might have been underreported or less understood than they should be in recent years. So, Richard, maybe just to start us off, can you give our audience what's essentially kind of the elevator pitch of your book? What's the core message of what you found, what you argue for? What's kind of the main thing people need to know jumping into this issue?
Yeah, so most of my work before this has been about inequality, education, a lot on intergenerational mobility, like what helps people to move up. And actually that's I think how Beth and I ended up working together and overlapping. And so it's great to be talking to you, Beth, being hugely influenced by your work on higher education. And so I just kept hitting these data points where it's boys and men who seem to be on the wrong side of the chart. And then I'm raising 3 boys as well. They're all grown now, they're all in their 20s. But this conversation about what's actually happening with boys and men, both just empirically, right, just the data showing big gender gaps on lots of fronts that I can outline, but also then the conversations around the dinner table. Like what did you do in school today? Well, we had a lesson on toxic masculinity or whatever. Or dating today is very different to how it was. And so I think the question, it became clear to me that the question wasn't, is there going to be a conversation about what's happening to boys and men? The question was, who's going to have it? Who is having it? And I noticed that it was happening in a big way, especially online. It was happening especially among boys and young men, especially if they didn't think anyone else was listening. But it wasn't happening in the corridors of Brookings. And it wasn't happening in the corridors of the White House. And it wasn't happening in the seminar rooms of most of our colleges and universities. And so I think that created a really dangerous vacuum. So the elevator pitch is the problems are real, they're not confected, that there continue to be huge problems for women and girls, and that we have to tackle both. We don't have to choose between the two. It's not a zero-sum game. So you wouldn't say to a parent of a son and a daughter that they were only allowed to care about one of them. You'd probably expect them to care equally about both. And I think as a society, we have to do that. And so I don't know how nerdy we want to get very quickly, but there's a bigger gender gap in higher education today than there was in the 70s. It's just the other way around. We lose 40,000 men a year, tragically, to suicide. Wages for men without a college degree have been flat for half a century, and so on. And so these are just real hard data points. And the question is not, are they true? They're obviously true. The question is, how do we think about them? How do we talk about them? And then what do we do about them?
Richard, I wonder if you could tell us how this was received. I remember listening to your really early work on this, and I was struck by an interview that you did with Carol Hooven many years ago, the author of book about testosterone and how it makes boys different from girls. And, you touched on this idea of toxic masculinity in that conversation. And basically, I remember the two of you saying, yes, we need to admit boys and girls are different. And I grew up on the East Coast. I lived and worked on the East Coast for a long time. And that wasn't the sentiment that is, often expressed, or at least not in, decades past. So I wonder how you were received when you first started doing this work.
Yeah, well, I think that just because of the coincidence of timing, I was doing the work, I think, during the period where this was most fraught. And so actually, I actually couldn't get a publisher for the book when I was shopping it around in 2021. No one wanted to touch it. And that was not only personally humiliating, but also very useful in terms of realizing this is going to be a hard book to land. And it did make me rethink some of that. But a lot of people advised against it because it was just seen as quite a perilous issue to take on. But that, in a way, motivated me even more to do it, not because I'm drawn to peril. I think, as most people would tell you, I'm very cowardly when it comes to anything physical, and I don't particularly like being attacked, and I haven't been generally. But it did make me think, well, this shouldn't be so perilous. These are just facts. This is true, and then I do go into some criticisms of the way that both the political left and the political right have just, I think, really bungled this issue, leading us, I think, to the cultural situation that we're in now. And so I think we're scrambling a little bit to catch up after quite a big lag. And I was just trying to be part of that conversation to move that forward a bit. And the other thing, Beth, and you and I talked about this, I think, very early on, is like, as soon as you get people talking about their own kids or their own brothers or their own dads, you can't stop them talking. And so it was like a huge issue that everyone was talking about in their private lives, but almost nobody, except for perhaps some less savory figures online, were talking about in public life.
I think that's exactly right, Richard. And if I recall correctly, when I heard that interview, it was maybe a couple weeks after I'd for the first time seen my 2-year-old spike his water cup onto the floor after finishing it. And I thought, well, this isn't something that I did as a child. Like, maybe there's something here. And, yes. I'm a scientist, right? So I shouldn't be, using these small samples, but, there's something here. And I think that, your conversations and the things that you've been doing, it allow us to have a different conversation than the one that we felt enabled to have in the past.
Yeah, I recommend the book Boy Mum from Ruth Whitman on that front too. She comes at it as a fully signed up tabula rasa feminist. All the differences between are all socialized. Then she has boys and goes, yeah, that's not true.
Richard, I'm curious, what the pushback that you got early on, where was it coming from? Was it coming from people who just legitimately disagreed with the data or thought, well, the problem's not that bad? Or because I think even now, since this conversation's been happening, I see some people sometimes saying, well, what are men complaining about? You men have been running things for thousands of years. Like, what's the big deal? So I'm very curious, those early sort of warnings you received, was it just a fundamental disagreement, or was it well, yeah, those might be real problems, but for some reason we can't address them? Where did it come from, do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it was partly just the way that the lines had been drawn so tightly around this in terms of like polarization and partisanship. It was more just like there are some issues that you don't touch, and that's true of other issues, in both directions, right? And so this was just an issue that unless you were pretty firmly on the political right, you just wouldn't go near, because it clusters with the wrong issues, right? With the wrong other issues. So it's political, to be honest. Very few people can actually doubt. I mean, I was very careful to present the data in as bulletproof a way as I possibly could. I mean, I like to think I'm always careful, but I was doubly careful with this one, and massive peer review and commentary and so on, because I just couldn't afford to get any of this wrong. And so you can't really dispute the facts. What I got instead was, well, have you not noticed what's happening to women right now? Have you not noticed all the issues that are around women? Okay. Two thoughts can be true at once, would be my response, and that's true, and we need to continue to work on many of the issues facing women. Or, well, men have had it so good for such a long time. But I think, well, two wrongs don't make a right. And it turns out that a 12-year-old boy actually doesn't feel he should carry the full weight of 2,000 or 200,000 years of patriarchy. and that it's completely unfair to ask him to do so. And so it's like it's out of date. It's just unhelpful to act today as if the world is still the way it was. But I will say one more thing, which is it is a difficult conversation because of the ongoing issues facing women and girls and because of this long history. I think if you don't find it a slightly difficult conversation to have, you probably shouldn't be in it. But you shouldn't stop at the discomfort. You shouldn't stop and say, wow, this is difficult because there's still issues for women and girls. You acknowledge that discomfort, you recognize there's still those issues, and then you keep going and say it is also true that there are these problems for boys and men as well. Because if you allow that to be the moment at which you stop, the problems don't go away. The problems get neglected and then they turn into grievances. And that's just a very straightforward formula for turning problems into grievances, is to ignore them. And so I think too many people, particularly on the centre left, allowed their discomfort with the issue, which is an understandable and in ways honourable discomfort, to prevent them from acknowledging straightforwardly these problems. And that created a very dangerous vacuum in our culture.
Do you think that's where we are, Richard, that we've evolved this conversation to a place where we have grievances more than we have problems? And, is that pushing us politically in this moment?
Yeah, I think we are really struggling to catch up with what I think has been a really significant cultural shift around gender politics over the last 10 years. I was just looking at some data from David Shaw that he presented on Ezra Klein's show recently, a competitor of yours in the podcast space, I would say, for nerdiness anyway. And there is a chart there which you cannot unsee once you've seen it, which shows that the gender gap in the last election was widest among 18-year-olds, followed by 19-year-olds, followed by 20-year-olds, followed by 20, etc. So the gender gap was biggest. And so, unfortunately, the very ferocity of the discussion about gender in both directions over the last 10 years has created a situation where young men and young women don't see their interests as being aligned with each other. In fact, in many ways, they seem as being opposed to each other. And again, I think you can be even-handed here and fairly say that, for reactionaries, they say to boys and men, you're struggling because of all those women and all those feminists and all those woke progressives who hate you, really. And then on the left, what you'll get is telling young women, which is you're struggling, you're never going to get paid enough, you're always going to be discriminated against, you're never going to survive. Why? Because of all those men over there who are toxic and mansplaining everything. And so the discourse on both sides has led to a situation in which young men and young women are blaming each other for many of their problems. And that's just bad for everything.
Richard, to build on that for a second, because I was thinking in similar terms, trying to, again, wrap our heads around why there has been a discomfort for this conversation, broadly speaking, kind of the flourishing of both men and women broadly, and in this case, the flourishing of men and boys. From my perspective, it kind of seems like whenever we have an impasse as a society where it feels difficult to talk about important issues, it seems like it's because one or both sides have been using that issue as a cudgel with which to attack the other side. And I'm consider myself a political conservative, and so maybe in some ways I'm a little more sensitive to it on that side, that anytime issues of the environment, poverty, homelessness, mental health, issues that conservatives maybe have typically shied away from, there seems to be a history of the other side using that as a tool that, well, if you engage with me on this issue, I'm just going to beat you up with this issue. And to your point, it can exist on the other side as well. Do you see that as a kind of a, let's all kind of put down our weapons together and say, we can disagree and have debates, but let's stop trying to use these issues purely just to attack the other side, especially when it's not warranted?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that putting down the weapons, putting down the tools is great, a bit utopian. At this stage, I think we've got to just lower the temperature, is the way I like to think about it. Like, I think it's going to have to be somewhat gradual. We're not suddenly going to get a truce in the culture war. But I do think we can lower the temperature. And I think that will take politicians and leaders and think tankers and everybody on both sides to just, if we can just get the dial down from 9 to 8 and then to 7 would be helpful. With that long-term goal, I agree. And I agree also that there's a sort of villainization that goes on in this current current moment, I agree with that, with the finger pointing and the search for who's to blame. And you really see that coming out in polling now with a lot of men. Actually, I think the majority of Republican men, but a lot of Democrat men too, thinking that men are discriminated against more than women now in the labor market. That's just not true. But it's also not true that the gender pay gap is largely caused now by discrimination against women. It's for other more complex reasons about childcare and family structure and so on. And so but both sides are actually kind of leaning into this idea that like they're out to get you and I've got your back, right? And you can see how that's animating. It works very well on social media. It might make for some good short-term politics, but I don't think it makes for good policy. And it certainly doesn't make for a generation that feels like they're allied. Which is what really concerns me, is the sense of young men and young women feeling like pulled away from each other. I will say that a good first step is just to try and avoid the pathologization of the other side. And again, in both directions. And so I think that the language from the left about toxic masculinity and mansplaining and the patriarchy and you just don't get this, men are trash, etc., has been profoundly unhelpful in terms of sort of the signals, the messages that men have received. But of course, I think the opposite is also true, right? I think the idea of kind of it's the woke people, it's the feminazis, etc., that you get from the online, the other side is also deeply unhelpful. And so I think like if we could at least stop pathologizing each other, that would be a good start.
And Richard, that's one of the things I like about when you created the American Institute for Boys and Men, which you now serve as president for. I pulled just a line from the website. It's kind of your mission articulation. And on the website, it says, too many boys and men are struggling at school, at work, and in their families and communities. The American Institute for Boys and Men is the first national organization committed to objective research and policy development to enhance the well-being of boys and men. What I love about that articulation is it does not in any way edge out where there might be legitimate challenges for women that are still worth addressing, which has been one of your key talking points, but it basically says it's about flourishing. There's clear data that men and boys are not flourishing today. In many ways, they are flourishing less than they used to. How do we address it? And it can stand on its own merits. Can you talk about that framing seems oriented to accomplish the objective you just laid out for the discussion?
Yeah, and so one of our internal mottos at the Institute is keep it boring. And we very often refuse media requests or ideas for research papers on the grounds that would be way too interesting. And by that I mean it's in the culture war stuff. It's going to get clicks. And actually, when I mentioned that to one of my sons, that was our motto, keep it boring, he said, "Well, you're definitely the man for that job, Dad," which is high praise. And even when you read that out, I thought, God, that's really boring. That's excellent. Because I do sort of think that's part of the problem with this, is that people are kind of drawn to the sort of cultural issues. They're drawn to whereas actually, let's look at high school graduation. Let's look at college completion. Let's look at mental health. Let's look at what's happened to wages. Why is it that technical high schools and P-Tech schools and stuff seem to do better for boys? And what can we learn from the curricula? I mean, I know you guys are loving this, but I got to tell you, that doesn't get you much traction on TikTok, right? And so I do think that making this a mainstream issue is a big part of our approach, and to avoid unnecessary partisanship, culture war stuff, or just tearing anybody else's stuff down. I mean, one of our other mottos is never attack, never go negative, right? Why spend your time just kind of proving person A to be wrong? There's too much to do, and it's not that person A isn't wrong sometimes, but it's just what is that really where you want to spend your energy? I think it's only occurring to me to think about it this way now, but I think so much intellectual energy now is being channeled in kind of negative directions. There's a lot of negative intelligence around, and there are some very, very smart people with brilliant minds that are almost entirely used for negative purposes. And I'm not saying you don't need some of that in a well-functioning society. You do, but when you see some of our best minds largely engaged in showing why the other side is stupid and wrong, that does make me worry.
Well, that's actually part of the theme of this show, defending ideas. We didn't call it attacking bad ideas. We want to find good ideas and equip.
You would have
our
gotten
listeners
much more. You would have gotten more followers if you'd said,
That's right.
That's true.
Attacking stupid people online. That's a great name for a podcast.
We could rebrand.
There's still time. Producer Spencer, let's look into that. Just kidding. But to your point, Richard, it's the constructive nature of this seems really compelling to me, and because you focus so much on the data. And I wonder if we could spend some time kind of diving into, in a little bit more depth, some of the findings. You talk a lot about education. You've mentioned the labor market, mental health. Just what are the things that people need to know that is just objectively true in the data that's affecting men and boys?
Yeah, so, I mean, we could do education first, maybe, and then see if I'll say some stats and then see if Beth can tell me if I've got them right or not. But if you take the average school district, the median school district in the US, the boys are almost a grade level behind in English and literacy, and there's no gap in math. That's up to 8th grade. This is Sean Reardon's work out of Stanford. That partly is because there's a big gap in school readiness, depending on how you measure it. But there's a double-digit percentage point gap in whether the share of boys and girls who are school ready at 5, which feeds through to 8. And then by the end of high school, there's a huge gap in GPA. So if you take the top 10% of students ranked by GPA, there are twice as many girls as boys. And if you take the bottom 10% of students, there are twice as many boys as girls. So if you're just looking at that top 10% of the high school distribution, which is where a lot of selective colleges look, of course, then it's already 2/3 female. Interestingly, there isn't a gender gap on SAT. Not at the average. It's a little bit of overrepresentation of boys, if anything, at the top, about 57% of the top decile. But also boys are represented at the bottom of the SAT distribution as well, as what some scientists call the males at the tails phenomenon. That then feeds into college, where it's about 60-40 now, 4-year degree acquisition, which, as I mentioned at the top of the show, is about a reversal of what we had the other way in the 1970s. And that's both because boys are less likely to enroll, young men are less likely to enroll, but also less likely to complete. It looks to me as if about half of it is an enrollment gap and about half of it's a completion gap. I don't know if that's still true. Does that sound about right to you, Beth, in terms of like this gender gap in college?
Yeah, that sounds right. And I was going to encourage you to go back, too, because when you talk about the school ready piece of it, it kind of sounds like these kids start behind and they stay behind. But, as a mom, I that didn't live in this space, I might think, well, what are we doing to our boys? Are we not teaching them to read? Are we not pushing them? But there's a deeper difference. And you write about that. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, there is. I mean, some of these skills are just harder for boys to acquire, especially around kind of language and communication skills. And I think to think that isn't at least partially coming naturally is just, is insane, honestly.
And there's real there's real physiological differences.
Really differences. That's right.
Development of the boy's brain. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one of the ideas I've had is to actually at least give parents the option to start their boys in school later. Because they do just develop later. And so the period, so boys are behind, yes, as you say, from the beginning. But when you see these really big gaps open up, seems to be in middle and then through into high school. And also those are the most consequential years, of course. And there is a huge gap in what social scientists would call like non-cognitive skills or executive functioning. And there's this bit of the brain, the frontal cortex, which is sometimes called the CEO of the brain. And it just develops between 1 year and 2 years earlier in girls than in boys, in large part because girls enter puberty earlier than boys, and that seems to trigger the development of this. It's like it's the bit of your brain that has you turn in your homework. It's the bit of your brain that can defer gratification, do a bit of planning. Planfulness is a term I borrow from Paula England for this. And girls just get there earlier. And it turns out, for me anyway, that's a good plausible explanation for why you see this huge gap in GPA, which I think rewards those skills, staying on track, turning in your homework, going to class, all that. But not really a gap on SAT, which is more, I think, a measure of just intelligence, right, where there isn't a gender gap. And so that leads me to think there's just something about schools that isn't serving boys quite as well. But part of that is because they're just younger. A 15-year-old boy is just younger on average than a 15-year-old girl, and as every parent ever would tell you.
Right. And Richard, tell us more about this dynamic. I mean, is it that boys are falling behind, or is it that girls are catching up? What's going on here?
Yeah, well, that's a great distinction, I expect, of course, between relative and absolute and what's really happening. And so the way I think, and this is something that does vary a bit internationally, but in the US, what I think has happened is that you've just seen this huge increase in educational outcomes for girls and young women over the last few decades. Actually, girls were always a little bit ahead on GPA, like even back to the 50s. And so I think that speaks to this natural advantage. Like the gap wasn't as big, but it's a remarkable that even back then, I think that shows probably there's something a bit more baked in. But since then, of course, we've gone out of our way, quite rightly, to reduce the barriers for girls succeeding in school. We've strongly encouraged them to go to college, to do well. There's been a big push around girls doing better. And so the biggest cause of the gap is just the fact that boys have not kept pace with girls.
So we sort of unleashed girls to start to fulfill what is maybe their inherent advantage. And in doing so, revealed what's, a deficiency for boys.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it depends. The language is difficult, isn't it? I mean, it's because I really take pains not to end up talking about boys like they're malfunctioning girls. But right. I think the education system does that to them, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think I just did, so I take
a little
back.
bit. Yeah, a little bit. And I think, look, one of the things I think that we can learn from the left is to look to structural causes as well as just individual ones. And so I look at the education system and just say, look, is it boy-friendly enough? And my answer is no. It doesn't mean that shouldn't help boys, but like massive decline in share of male teaching, much less applied learning, less hands-on learning. And I do think it's fair to say that the culture of the K-12 education system, particularly, maybe even colleges too, just become a little bit more female-friendly.
Right.
And so I think that we should actually look at the way in which the systems of the education, just systems and culture of education may be holding boys back, just as I think the systems and culture of, say, politics holds women back, right? I think we've got the search for structural causes, I think, is a bit of a gift from the left. It's not the only answer, but weirdly, the left will typically not apply that to this particular case when it comes to boys and men. They're much more interested in individual explanations than structural ones.
What are the fixes then? I mean, if what, it feels like kind of the layman interpretation of what you're describing is this: sit down at a desk, turn in your homework, follow the rules. This is something that is a system that's advantaging girls in the status quo. What sorts of reforms are reasonable in schools that could make them better meet the needs of boys' learning styles at this stage?
Well, we've talked a bit about giving boys at least the option to start a little bit later. I think that would level the playing field. Girls just have this developmental advantage. I do think that a big push around male teachers is long overdue. We've had a decline in the share of K-12 teachers who are male from 33% in the 80s to 23% today and falling, especially in middle and high schools. By the way, that also means we lose a lot of our coaches because about a third of male teachers are also coaches. They do that about 4 times the rate of female teachers for all kinds of reasons that we could get into, probably about childcare responsibilities and so on. But again, the fact remains that we lose those male role models in on the playing fields as well as kind of in the classroom. More applied learning, more technical learning, high quality CTE, especially as concentrated in technical high schools, P-Tech schools. It does look to me from the evidence that boys on average, I should just say, look, I'm just saying on average. Your listeners know I'm saying on average. When we say there's a difference between men and women, we're saying something similar to like there's a difference in height between men and women. Not like, it's not that all women are like this, all men are like this. But it does look as if boys in particular, they kind of need to know why before they care about what. They do need to understand the reason for it. So I think more applied learning style. I think that's why these technical high schools do better. It's just because they know why they're being told to learn it. Girls are a little bit better at just obediently doing something even when they can't see the point of it. Right, and that's not necessarily great either, which also means that if we make education better, it'll be particularly good for boys, but it won't be bad for girls. I just think girls are better at surviving a suboptimal educational experience than boys are, and so optimizing it would actually end up pulling them up too. So those would be some of the places I would at least start on the education front. Of course, then we can get into issues around family policy and the labor market, but I do think that if we can't take seriously some of these problems of boys in K-12 education, then a lot of the other stuff is going to be much harder.
And some of those fixes really extend through higher education as well.
Higher education too,
so.
yeah.
Did you want to shift gears to talking about labor market?
Well, yeah, I do want to get to that, but I also want to, there's something you said that prompted a question on the family side of things. Because Richard, when you talk about the share of male teachers having declined, and that would be a potential intervention, is efforts to get more male teachers into the classroom. Have you seen anything in your data that, I guess, one, what does the evidence show is the positive impact of male teachers in the classroom on boys in the class? And does that differ whether the boy comes from a married two-parent household or a single-parent household? Like, I'm wondering, does a male teacher help do something if the student does not have a relationship with their father, or is it kind of consistent? I'm trying to see if there's a connection with family structure, if that makes sense.
That's so interesting. I mean, I'll be honest and say that the evidence for the impact of male teachers on boys' academic outcomes isn't very strong, not because people have done lots of research on it and not found the link, but because people haven't done the research on it. We're trying to fill that gap at AAPM, of course, in part. To the extent there has been research on it, it tends to lean positive. But I worry a lot about that. I think it's just really hard to tease out all the other effects. But you do raise an intriguing possibility, which is that there does seem to be some stronger evidence for black boys and having kind of particularly kind of black male teachers around them. That looks a little bit more solid to me. And so that does invite the possibility that could well be that, given what we know about the family structure, particularly for black Americans, is that actually there is more of a substitution effect there around the kind of role models, etc., coaching, fathering. I don't know. That's purely speculative, but it's an intriguing possibility that you'll see even more benefit from having men in the classroom for the boys who perhaps don't have male role models in the home. So I think that's a really good research question. At this point, I think no one has actually really tried to address it, but I'm adding it to the list of things that my researchers are going to do right now.
And I think it ties into that broader question about the role of the family. And when I think of this men and boys issue, I tend to think of it in the three buckets of health, vocation, and purpose. And you outline so many of these things articulately and with just troves of data in your book and the work of the Institute. But that purpose question, I mean, family structure, you could argue, and we've done a lot of work here at Sutherland on this front, it creates some upstream effects for all of those areas, for educational outcomes, for economic outcomes, for a sense of purpose and thriving. And I'm just curious as your thoughts is what role do you see sort of the family structure, marriage, those kinds of things? Because again, that might be an area where left and right might approach it differently. Just curious how we ought to navigate that.
Yeah, so I'll be equally unfair to both sides before so I think, I've talked a lot to people about this on both sides. It's interesting. It's the biggest criticism I get from thoughtful social conservatives, and I've debated people like Brad Wilcox and Ian Rorrow and others on this, is that I focus more on fatherhood than I do on marriage. And that their view is fatherhood matters, engaged fatherhood matters, and guess how you get that? Through this tried and tested institution called marriage, right? And they have a lot of good evidence on their side, to be clear, some of which I produced myself. But given that most kids born to non-college educated Americans are born outside marriage now, I think it's very important that we don't inadvertently bench the fathers who aren't married to the kid's mother. Right? I think the way forward is to really reinforce the relationship between a father and their kids, which is somewhat independent of the relationship between the father and the mother. I think the old model was like a dotted line, right? It was like a direct line from dad to mum to each other, and then a direct line from mum to the kids. And you know how in org charts you get this kind of dotted line relationship? That was a little bit like the fathers. The old joke was that like mothers knew their kids' worst fears and greatest hopes, the names of their best friends and worst enemies, and fathers were vaguely aware that there were small people in the house. Now, that's the kind of old stereotype for sure, certainly for those of us who raise their own kids. But that model is just not sustainable anymore. So that'd be the attack I'd get from the right. From the left, the argument would be like, why, you're saying that you're saying dads can do things mums can't do? What about single parents? What about same-sex parents, right? That's very heteronormative of you, is a comment I've had more than once. To which I'm like, look at the evidence, right? The evidence is really clear that dads do matter and lots of it overlaps, but dads do some different things to mums, especially over the course of the whole kid's life. And that's great. So I think for me, what we should be doing is making sure that fathers really do matter in our public policy, and that we don't fall into the kind of trap of assuming dads only matter if they're married. Not that I'm against marriage. By the way, I think more engaged fatherhood would lead to more marriage. That's my view. I think the causal arrow would run that way. And it connects to this point about purpose, because one thing that the traditional family really did do was send a very clear signal to men about why we needed them. Like, my dad never had to think about why we needed him. When he lost his job, he worked in manufacturing in the UK. When he lost his job, he had to get another job. Why? Because he was the breadwinner, right? It was no discussion between him and my mum about that. And so he never had this doubt about why he was kind of needed by the family. And I think that, to get anthropological for a moment, I do think that feeling needed by the tribe, by the community, by the family is central to human well-being and human flourishing. That sense you're connected to people and things beyond yourself. And I'll go one step further and say I think that is particularly important for men. Because for women, I think that the sense of being needed is just a little bit more baked in, right, for reproductive reasons, right? I don't think that it's ever been as much of a question for women, does the tribe need me? But I think for men, it's always been a question. Does the tribe need me? And I just don't think we're answering that question very well right now for young men. And we've answered it in different ways at different periods of time. And we can't answer it the same way today, but we have really got to answer it.
Can work be a component of that? I don't want to shortchange kind of the family and the purpose conversation, because that's vital. We've got just a few minutes left, and I think we'll have a lot of conversations in the coming months on these issues, because the sense of purpose, again, I just think that's so important to mental health, to vocation, to all these kinds of things. But how does this tie with work? Because I want to make sure we get some time to talk about the labor market, that this feeling of, from what I've seen in some of the anecdotal experiences and pastorals and some of the data, that one of the contributors to the mental health crises for men and some of the suicide rates for men is a lack of being needed. It's like, well, society doesn't need me. I don't know even why I'm here. Obviously, family, other aspects of purpose, how can work play a role? And I'm thinking of, I think Nicholas Eberstadt has done some great work on the decline of labor force participation among men. Beth is going to be way more articulate than I am on that kind of stuff. But talk about the economy, work. How does that play a role? And can it help bolster the sense of, we need you, you have a purpose?
Yeah, it certainly should. I mean, it's true that we've seen just a huge shock to the labour market, of course, in a way that has disproportionately affected men. Whether that's going to continue to be true, I think, is a different question. But historically, that's true. We've lost a lot more, quotes, male jobs. But I think there's a deeper question here, which you're getting at, which is, what is it that causes men to want to work, and especially to work hard? And there's very good evidence that actually being married, being a dad, has driven all of that, I think, as you just alluded to, right? There's a supply side effect here too. And so I do think it's a really important question to say, well, how do we keep men motivated? I think it's just not obvious that they're going to think, yeah, I should go into it, particularly if the job sucks to start with, right? And then you're going to have to kind of climb up this ladder. And it's why would you do that? Well, the traditional answer was to look after my family. That's why my dad looked for that. I mean, he said to me, like, I've still got a job. I've got to get another job to look after you all, right? And so I do think we've got to be honest about the fact that that has been a hugely important propulsive force in society of connecting men to the labour market, to family. I don't think those things are separable. But I think it has to be in a new way, and particularly through the institution of fatherhood, and how, like, your kids still need you. And by the way, your neighbors' kids might still need you, and your scout group needs you, and your church needs you. And I think we just need to find multiple spaces in which boys and men continue to feel needed, even if it's not going to be in quite the same way as it was for their fathers. And I think we've made the mistake of thinking that we don't need to do that. And that would be the first society in human history to think that we don't need to find a way to help boys become men and find institutions that make them feel connected to the whole. I think that would be a hubristic mistake, but I do think that's been part of it. It's been a bit of a suspicion about male-specific calls. But there's always a contest for the allegiance of young men. The question is, who wins it? And right now, I think some of the wrong people are winning it. But we have to have a better call, which is that does your church need you? Does your family need you? Does your workplace need you? Does your neighborhood need you? And the answer is yes, 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 and yes. But that has to be stated explicitly. And we have to find really important roles for those boys and men, which are compatible with the era of gender equality that I think most of us welcome.
Well, I want to kind of drive home that point as we wrap up. But Beth, is there anything else on the labor market side from your expertise as an economist? I mean, what do you see from Richard's work that can maybe help guide some of these conversations moving forward? Maybe some of the reforms we would propose. Again, this idea of orienting men towards purpose, towards vocational pursuits, towards work, towards these other civic institutions. Anything that stands out to you from kind of that economist lens?
Well, I mean, Richard talked about the trends of, the disruption of jobs that are disproportionately done by men historically. But, I really don't think that's where the story is even. I think what Richard just highlighted is more important, this issue of purpose, this issue of motivation. And quite frankly, I'm not sure economists have a lot to say about that. So I'm glad that we're having this conversation in a more holistic way.
Yeah, one of my lines is that we need anthropologists more than economists to help us answer this question, because I do think it's cultural. One thing I will say, and this is a chance to plug some work we've got coming out, which is we've seen a decline in the share of men in health and education and caring professions, not just a failure to increase the share of men in those professions as we've increased the share of women in traditionally male ones, but actually a decline. The share of male social workers has halved in the last 20, 30 years. The share of male psychologists has dropped by more than half. I've already mentioned the decline in the share of male teachers. And those are growing jobs. And so we call these HEAL jobs, health, education, literacy. And we're just about to publish a report which actually just details how much growth there is in those professions. What was interesting as I was reading, I think it was a piece in the Wall Street Journal recently about the slight uptick in the share of men in nursing. And they did interviews with men who are nurses. I was really struck by how many of them had just said, well, it's a pretty good job and it's going to help me raise my family. And so they weren't going into nurses because they'd gone through, some sort of like progressive, brainwash to just say, you can be a nurse, men can be nurses too. It's because they looked around and saw a job that seemed to pay pretty well and that would help them look after their family. But I do think there's a huge opportunity for us there to help men to see some of those traditionally female-coded jobs as being for them. It has to be done quite carefully, but that's one of the areas I really want to push on in the next couple of years.
I like that a lot.
Richard, the last question I want to ask you as we wrap up here is the kind of moving forward. Let's try and give some talking points to our listeners out there. Our audience here in Utah, and the podcast has reached far beyond Utah, all over the country. So anyone listening to this who is maybe sitting there thinking, a lot of this resonates with me. This is really compelling. I want to engage on this issue. I'm not sure how. I'm a little nervous. Again, I could probably channel kind of some of the maybe conservative-leaning folks out there that get a little nervous about what might feel to them like moving towards sort of an equity-based conversation, that the only way we solve this is 50-50 representation, men and women in every category. I think there's a lot of folks on the right that say, no, that's not the right approach. But we want to clear the barrier so everyone has the opportunity to kind of build the life they want, to flourish. And you've articulated well some of the sensitivities on the political left. So I wonder if you could just give maybe a roadmap or a framework for anyone thinking of folks on the right and on the left who they feel some resonance, but they're not sure how to engage and they're a little nervous. How can we give them some comfort and some guidance so we can have the productive kind of conversation you articulated at the beginning?
Yeah, well, the first thing I would say is just to try and get past that first fear, which you've articulated, which I agree with, which is to say that we do want equality, but that doesn't mean we want androgyny. And there are some differences between boys and girls in the education system. There are some differences in the revealed preferences of men and women in the labor market, right? They're just not that big, right? They don't explain the underrepresentation of women and men in the current occupations, but I certainly don't think we're going to get to 50-50. One of my favorite examples is smoke jumpers. I mean, as one of my the guys that they jump out of perfectly serviceable airplanes into a blazing inferno for days on end. And as one of my female friends said to me, and it's almost all men, said to me, well, yeah, you can have that one. So I don't think we have to get to 50-50 childcare workers, 50-50 smoke jumpers, right? I don't think we have to. And also we should honor the fact that there are some differences there. But what I would say is start with the data. If you're interested in data, how many male teachers are there in your school district or in your school? What are the results? How do they look? What can we do about that? Start to apply some. At least have the conversation. I do think we're still at a point in this where having an open, honest, and fact-based conversation about this is the progress. And so what that means is to just engage in this with curiosity, not contempt, and to allow for the fact that this is difficult, allow for the fact that there are going to be like different views about this. As I said, earlier, like it should be difficult, but if you're a parent, if you have sons, ask your boys, how they feel about this stuff and how they're doing. Ask your daughters, ask the people in your family who are dating. Like, how's it going, right? What's it like now? And be curious, be open-minded about that. And then if you have any kind of institutional position to actually continue to just ask good questions about the data or the trends, then I think now's the time to do that. But we're still at the stage, I think, of, if I borrow a term from the women's movement, of consciousness raising. And we need to raise people's consciousness around this issue, which is there are real problems for boys and men. Doesn't mean giving up on women and girls. Let's find out what they are, and then we can begin to have a thoughtful conversation about how to address them with as big a tent as possible. Because I really don't think this should be a partisan issue. And in fact, maybe I should finish with this. There was a very good survey from one of Beth's colleagues, Dan Cox, from the Survey on American Life at AEI, which asked parents, are you worried about, boys growing up and girls growing up? And liberals were a bit more worried about girls than conservatives were, but they were equally worried about boys. And so it turns out that if you just ask parents, like, should we worry about boys and men? Yeah. And I have to tell you that if I've been careful to talk to lots of different people about it. If I talk to a very, very young, super progressive woman in my circle and talk about male mental health, talk about boys at school, talk about some of the issues, she is all here for that because she's worried about her brother and she's worried about her friends and she's worried about her dad. And she's also worried about her own career prospects and some of the challenges she might face as a woman, because guess what? She can think more than one thing at the same time. And that is true for almost everybody. If you set the table the right way, everyone will come to it.
Well, I think we'll leave it there, Richard. That is such a motivating way to close out the conversation. But the discussion continues. We'll be doing a lot of these kinds of discussions on defending ideas and try to elevate this issue here in Utah and beyond to find some solutions. So again, Richard, thank you. Richard Reeves, author of Boys and Men, president of the American Institute for Boys and Men. We'll include this in the show notes. Please, guys, go read the book, buy it and read it, and be part of the conversation.
Well, buy it at least. I guess if you want to read it, you can. It's really boring, but buy it.
Fair enough. The purchase is the metric.
If you're into that sort of thing, it's a great read.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Richard.
Thanks a lot. That was
Richard.
Fun.
Well, we're going to take one more final break before we leave you with some final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back. Just like Richard and Beth said during our discussion, the challenges that boys and men face in our society today is a personal issue for me too. I'm the father of 2 young boys, and I want them to flourish as they grow up and become men. I want them to do well in school, find fulfilling work opportunities, have healthy, meaningful relationships, and raise families of their own one day. In short, I want them to feel well-grounded in their purpose and the unique things they have to offer. So it's important that we as a state and nation elevate the consciousness of some of the challenges that may stand in the way for all the families out there who recognize this issue. 2 things really stood out to me from our discussion with Richard and Beth that I think can actually help you and I as we start talking about this more. First, recognizing that men and boys face unique challenges does not mean that we can't appreciate and support the many opportunities that women and girls have today. We can hold both of these views at the same time. And that doesn't mean that you or I have to automatically accept narratives from a particular political viewpoint that we may not agree with. But it does mean that we should rely on good data and evidence as an anchor to the discussion. And second, as with most issues, there are too many forces on the left and the right that would use issues like this solely as a weapon to attack the other side. That kind of polarized contempt simply isn't productive. and often isn't even an accurate way to articulate the core issue. Yes, we can and will likely disagree on causes and solutions, but we should do so in a spirit of constructive collaboration, recognizing that all of us want men and boys, and women and girls, to have tremendous opportunities to lead thriving lives. We'll continue a series of discussions on this topic, and I hope you'll stay engaged with us throughout and share your thoughts with me as you go. Well, that'll do it for this episode of Defending Ideas. If you enjoyed this discussion, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can access previous episodes and watch or listen on your favorite platform. And don't forget to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you like to get your shows. And please share this episode on your own social media profiles or with a friend, family member, or coworker who may find it interesting. And lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, if you want more conversations like this, please contribute at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thanks again for joining us on Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.